Hello again, Steve here with a few words about National Celebration Days. My wife was having I was there too actually, she had hosted a Canada Day celebration, or backyard barbecue and whatnot at her place, and invited a few people over. And there was somebody from America, from the United States there, who was marveling over at how Canada could have an Independence Day had their independence without a war. And I said to her, I said, well, Canada never became independent as we know it. I mean, you can't think of it in terms of the US as we see it and Canada. It's two different kinds of approaches. It's two different kinds of approaches to the nation state, if you will. America, or as a group of people down there in those colonies, they said we don't want to deal with the monarchy of England anymore. So we're going to create our own thing. But England didn't want it. England said, no, you got to put your guns away, you got to obey us and so on. But they didn't take that. So the only way to talk to an army is basically with bullets. So that's what they responded with. And then they created their own constitution. At least that's how the story goes anyway. A place like Canada, nation state of Canada, has a constitution, but it is not organic to the society of people here or whatever. It's an act of the British Parliament, right? So you can't claim to be independent as a nation when somebody else's place, some other place, creates your constitution, which is the foundation of all the nation's laws, apparently, right? I usually don't talk about nations because they're all just fictions, or countries especially. But just to give a little bit of context in terms of this, and Canada's, after all, is not called Independence Day. It's called Canada Day now, and not very long ago, it was called Dominion Day, which is, if you think about it, is exactly the opposite of independence, right? If you're a dominion, you're basically a domain. It's a domain of the British Commonwealth, of the British Empire, or Britain, or whatever, or the Queen, or the Crown, or something. You're a domain, right? And the people are all called subjects. A subject is kind of like a serf. It's like an underling, right, of something else. Versus in Jeffersonian republicanism, the people are the top. The people are basically the equivalent of the crown. So it's completely upside down. They're not comparable. So consequently, I'd say in principle, I mean, functionality-wise, forget it. But in principle, what the Americans were after at the time was a glorious idea, really, in reality. It was this idea of independence. And, with what I talk about in the Inner Genie Project, the Inner Genie is that we all have this genius within us, which from here can go bursting forth. We can create a lot. Sure, we depend on a lot of people and so on in our families and whatnot. But if we are going to expect others to behave in a certain way, we're going to live a pretty miserable life. We might as well get in terms, how about we get involved with where we have the most influence, which is on ourselves, right? But I want to talk a little bit about this because this topic of independence and so on was inspired partly by the discussion I had with this person from the States. And also, I just watched a video by Stefan Molyneux, who I'm a big fan of, by the way. Very great work the man is doing. And I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but the passion there is unbelievable for truth. And he did this video, I think it's called What Pisses Me Off About Independence Day / July 4th. And I think what he's getting at is that, what people went through to create this independence is astounding. And Independence Day today is not a celebration of that anymore. It's just about watching fireworks and eating a lot of food and getting fat and talking about how great trivialities are, as opposed to look at what it took to build this. Look at the effort that people went through to create this, along that line anyway. And so the independence, I thought, is a really interesting one, because he mentioned in there a quote by, Stefan did, a quote by a guy named Alexander Fraser Tytler or Tytler, I'm not sure, who was a notable intellectual back in the a couple of hundred years ago in Scotland, and he was a professor and he was a writer on you know, politics and whatnot. And he said something very interesting about democracy. He was very much of a skeptic of politics. In fact, he called it a fanciful utopia or a chimera or something. It's not possible to ever happen. But what he did, but he was very much of a historian as well. So he looked back in history where democracy had been tried before, and how it's always failed over a period of time, and it always goes through a certain series of events until it crashes. I'll read this to you, but you can look it up too. You just look up Alexander Fraser Tytler, Tytler, quotes. Just type it in and you'll find it. Just type in Alexander Fraser Tytler on democracy and you'll find it. This one is under, I believe it's called Quotable Quotes. Anyway, here's what he said. A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses under loose fiscal policies, always followed by a dictatorship. That's interesting. Always followed by a dictatorship. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations has been 200 years. These nations have progressed through this sequence, from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage. That is amazing. And actually, you know, when we look at, you see, when we look at the term that the Americans used for their celebration day, Independence Day, it talks about here, when they get back to this apathy, they go back into dependence, right? And from dependence, they go back to bondage. So what's their last thought? When they're in bondage, this all started out with bondage. So their last thought or their last experience was dependency. You couldn't do anything. I was reading this story by Rose Wilder Lane, who's Laura Ingalls' daughter, and it's called, I think it's called, it was a book on freedom, and you just type in book on freedom by Rose Wilder Lane, and she was talking about how when she was in, the difference at the time between the American way of governance versus the European, especially continental Europe. She was in France at one time. This was in the early 1900s, before the Second World War, and her friend bought a car to drive around Europe, and it took them several weeks to actually get the car that they could drive it. They had to go through like 10 different bureaucratic offices, and they had to hire a professional photographer to take numerous pictures of it. And they followed all the rules to get this thing licensed. And even then it wasn't enough. Even they had to go back and do it again because another bureaucracy wanted their chomp at it. It reminds me very much of actually experience that my family and I had of licensing a car in Ontario only a few years ago. It sounded very similar. You can see the reversion back to this nonsense, right? So it's that's dependence, right? If it's like a child it doesn't have any liberty because it's dependent, right? It has to ask, Mommy, can I do this? Mommy, can I do? And you see kids when they're out with their parents is, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? It's always getting permission. All permits, permission. That's dependence. Independence is like when somebody finally becomes an adult, right? So Independence Day, They were dependent on England. They had to ask permission to do anything. They would just, England would arbitrarily just impose a tax on them. They were completely dependent on the whims of some, some royal or some duke or whatever in England to write something into the British Parliament. And then they supposedly had to do it. Just like Canadians, oh, how great we are in Canada. We get to run under the rules of some, monarch, what some parliamentarians say in the British House of Lords. It's dependence. And dependence leads to bondage. They knew that, right? So if you go through that process, it makes a lot of sense, right? So if you're in bondage, and of course you're completely dependent. I mean, if you're in a cell somewhere, you have to depend on your jailer. That's the only way you can eat. You're in a state of dependence, right? Therefore, you're in bondage. The more dependence you are, the more bondage you are. And it's interesting, when they break out of that, when they become independent, then the process begins again, right? They go from that bondage or that state of dependence into spiritual faith. And you saw that in the early Americas in the late 1700s, early 1800s. You had this flourishing of so many different faiths because they're running away from religious wars and religious tyranny in Europe, a lot of them, the Pilgrims and so on. And there was also all these new religions popped up. And they were very proselytic. I think about the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, maybe the Quakers. Some of the Quakers maybe came from Europe, but there was all the evangelicals and some of the Baptists and so on. These were new movements that were taking place, and of course also the New Thought, like the Emerson and these kind of guys. These were power of mind over matter. Like I think of guys like Norman Vincent Peale, who, prosperity theology and so on. This was a lot of the stuff that started coming about with this spiritual revival, right? So from bondage to spiritual faith to great courage, right? Because great courage is more than just bones and flesh and mind. It is something deep. It's like a moral courage. You have like a compass, living for something greater than yourself, right? And serving something. And from there comes great courage, right? So courage, once there's courage, then there can be liberty. Because you can stand up to tyranny with courage, right? If there's not courage, there's cowardice. And then the ruling classes can move in again. So that's, I guess, how liberty could come about. And from liberty comes abundance, right? Because when people are free, they're free to act. And they're free to create. And there's safety there, right? There's safety in liberty. So they create, and we saw that with the Industrial Revolution, and America was the most prosperous place the world has ever seen, right? And but people, people get selfish, people get greedy, if you will. They get selfish. They me once they get to, and it's also the generations thing. So the husband and wife built up something great, they created a lot of wealth, and now the kids, the generation afterwards, they're pretty pathetic. I actually I was reading something recently it was written quite a long time ago. I forget who it was now. He's talking about the rich man's son and how pathetic the rich man's son is very often, because they become this bloated little chubby. I see the Chinese immigrants come in, right? They're very slim and so on, and their kids are like, they look like the Michelin man, right? Because they're just eating too much. They're taken care of too much. People are funny that way. From selfishness to go to apathy. It's like this nihilism, this socialism. This is what matters. It's who cares? It's all everything's relative, man. There's no real compass anymore. It's loss of direction, and when that happens, in come the hordes who want to take over take all the goods, right? And that's what you see happening now too, with all the various different immigration of with all kinds of different values swooping in, right? And from apathy, then you go back to dependence, because when people are apathetic, they get controlled by something or somebody, right? And then the bondage comes back in again. So I just want to share this because it's not necessarily, if it's got nothing to do with us, it's got nothing to do with anything else, right? So we got to look at that for ourselves too. What bondage are we in, and what independence can we create? Maybe it's a good thing to look at our spiritual health. Maybe it's a good thing to look at our courage, at our liberty, at our selfishness, at our tendency for apathy, and our tendency to go into that cycle again. And maybe we can break the cycle for ourselves and make ourselves a better world and help to have a better quality of life. Steve here again, great chatting. Talk again soon. Bye for now.